I wasted all those years before, and now in just a month, I made this big leap.
This is just ridiculous. That doesn't make you fluent. Just make German friends, right?
No, it's not possible. They will speak English with you, and that will not change.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the German Learning Lab. I'm Michael and with me is my co-host Alessio. And today's question is whether one learns German faster in a German-speaking country, let's say Germany, or at home. Alessio has some first-hand experience. Alessio, what's your take on this?
Well, yes, I have some first-hand experience because I moved to Germany. It has been, 15 years ago? I got here, I couldn't speak any German. And my experience was mixed. So I learned very fast because I had a strong motivation, a lot of time on my hands, and also previous experience with learning languages on my own, linguistics, and so on. But on the other hand, the first months, and I'm using plural months, I just stayed home in Germany, so sitting in my flat, learning German, and not profiting from being in Germany at all. So even my experience was a positive experience from the point of view of how fast I learned, negative from the point of view of how much I profited from being in Germany. And in general, my opinion is that it's a very bad idea to move to Germany without any previous language knowledge. In most cases, it's detrimental. It's very bad for learning perspectives in the future. So we can go more in detail, but yeah, my first short answer is bad. What's your experience?
I have first-hand experience with other languages. I went to Poland with very little preparation, basically knowing the rough basics, and just jumped into the cold water, as we say in German. I did the same with Turkish, though I was a bit better qualified. I lived there for half a year, so I've been there. And I liked it a lot. Yeah, so I like trying to survive and picking things up from everywhere, but that's also a special skill of mine. And not that I'm fluent in Turkish. That actually was a weak spot. But I learned Polish up to level B2 in 2 years being there. And I was fluent in Polish back then. It's 20 years ago without any practice in between. Yet I really had a lot of time to spend studying. So like you, I spent time in libraries. I even had a friend who solely spoke Polish with me, despite him speaking English and German. And his mother gave me private lessons occasionally and all these things. So I had a lot of time. I didn't have much bureaucracy on my shoulders or anything else to take care of. Didn't have a family, all these things. And even then, I wouldn't recommend it. I'm totally with you. I would not recommend diving into this. But people like me and you, maybe they might still do it anyhow because that's who they are and they like this adventure. But if you have a choice, I recommend to really first get ready and then come here because there's so many things to deal with when you go to a new country with a very likely vastly different culture as well. As another topic we can look into, like what was the experience with the German culture as an Italian, which is a neighboring country almost.
Yes, cultural clash, of course, it's also a variable. But I think it's really in itself a bad idea, a bad strategic move for most people to move when they are not at least a little bit linguistically ready. But I think most people are convinced that to go full immersion, to move to the country is a good idea. And this is based on previous experiences, either their own or of other people, but with the languages they actually already learned before, and they don't realize this. Most Italians, for example, do this experience with English. They have been studying English maybe for years, 5 years, 8 years, even in school, but still never became fluent, never able to have an actual conversation. And then they go maybe on holiday, or maybe they move to the UK, they stay there for a month, 6 months, and they become fluent very quickly. And then their reasoning is, well, I wasted all those years before without seeing the result I wanted. And now in just a month, or maybe 3 months or 6 months, I made this big leap and I'm fluent. So next time, next language, for example, German, I will spare me the effort of going to schools or learning on my own before. I will just go there and learn there. Like, this is also what babies do, what children do, right? So I will do that. But they are making this mistake of not considering that in English, for example, they had a lot of schooling before, a lot of learning, and also a lot of practice because they have been reading English, listening to English in songs, but also on the internet, in so many contexts. They have so much previous knowledge they can rely on, and yeah, they don't have that in German. So this is the reason why I think maybe some of our listeners are thinking, no, they're wrong. I mean, I had a different experience with English, right? Or another thing is if a language is very similar to yours. When I've been living in France or in Spain, as an Italian, it has been way easier to bootstrap the basic language knowledge and to get to a point where I could understand enough and somehow explain myself, make me understandable, so that I could get to the point where I could engage in conversations or listening to natives and progress in language learning. But with a language like German, where there is a big gap between Italian and German, this was impossible. So trying to have a conversation after a couple of months, 3 months after starting learning German with a native makes no sense at all. You don't understand a sentence and you are unable to express anything meaningful or important for an adult. So I think this is why a lot of people think it's a good idea. They have this kind of experiences, but they don't understand how this doesn't apply to German. I think your experience with Polish and Turkish could be similar, right? Because Polish is quite different.
There's almost nothing that is close to German, right? And Turkish the same.
So before you can have a conversation in Turkish, it takes a while, I guess.
In the end, it doesn't matter whether you're in Germany or at home if you have the time to do the formal study, right? Because you need studying. You cannot just come to a country and magically you will pick up the language. Of course, you see signs and occasionally you overhear a word or two, but I cannot sit in a cafe and say, "Excuse me, could you speak louder? I want to immerse into your native language." This is just ridiculous. Just because you have to maybe utter a few phrases in the supermarket or at the dentist, that doesn't make you fluent. These are things that motivate you to maybe prepare such dialogues, but it's also very limited. The conversation I could have in any country or here via the internet with you, so it doesn't really matter where I am for that. But the main problem people have, they have a job. Usually people come here to work, right? So they have a demanding job. And that's not just 8 hours, that's usually 10 hours, at least including commuting time. Then they have to take care of bureaucracy. And maybe they have a relationship as well. And then the relationship has a family and your family. So life is happening. And when life is happening, you usually don't have 4 to 6 hours a day to study German.
Yeah.
While when you're at home, everything is settled. You know everything. You feel safe on the other hand as well, which also has a positive influence on your capability to learn. Less stress.
Yes.
Yeah? Less negative stress. Positive stress is fine. So all these things play a role into this. And unfortunately, this whole idea of immersion is still promoted by certain YouTubers, by language schools worldwide. Because you go to language school here in Berlin, at least, but also in Poland, where I was, people were teaching you using exclusively German. And that absolutely makes no sense.
Yeah, you're right. This is why I meant before it's even detrimental. When you're at home, like in your normal life situation, and so you have more time, more resources. People feel the opposite usually. Let's take an example of an Italian who wants to move to Germany. He's maybe thinking, here at home I have those few hours to study German, but if I were there, all time I would be immersed, so I would use my whole day, 14 hours a day. I would be somehow absorbing the language, and one pictures himself, as you said, in a cafe or going for some groceries and so on. But what actually happens is the opposite, in the sense that when you move as an expat, you actually have less time than when you are at home. So when you are in your normal situation, because you have everything under control and you have a lot of privileges you are unaware of, like everything is working smoothly, you don't need extra effort because you're not in a new country. So you have family, friends, and everything is already sorted out. So you have so much more time and resources to invest in a new language. When you move, the first year at least after you move to a new country is a constant challenge. A challenge that most people aren't prepared for. They can't imagine if they haven't done it before. And this takes a lot of time away from you. Also work, if you move to Germany and you aren't fluent in German, then you will be probably doing a job where you don't speak German. So all the time you spend working, you won't be practicing German, you maybe will speak English or some other language. So even worse, right? And often the mistake is to compare with an experience we did or someone else did when we were younger, maybe students. Because a student is then immersed in the language, like someone doing Erasmus or some kind of language exchange, is immersed in the language all the time. Like at the university in Germany, I had that privilege. I was immersed all the time. And you yourself have a lot of free time, and people you come in touch with are also young students, so they have time to spend time with you. But if you come as an adult, your job won't be in German, and the Germans you will meet will be busy adults who have no time to spend with you talking German at your very basic level. You said, for example, you have the mother of this friend of yours and your friend and helping you. This is very rare, so you are very lucky. In my experience with my clients, this is usually not the case. And then last thing is that people don't consider that when they are in a foreign country, they have psychological and social needs. So they still need, after work, to talk with people, to have some meaningful relationships and, emotional relationships, so family, friends, and so on. And they will not be able to have that in German. So they will spend their free time with people not speaking German, but speaking another language they are fluent in order to get that kind of human relationship, human closeness, you see? So talking about their problems, their emotions, their relationships, having a laugh.
They could just make German friends, right?
No, it's not possible, because if you're an adult and you want to be friends with another adult, you must be able to speak and to communicate, to share, to make a joke at an adult level. For children, it is easier because children can play on a level which is without words, pre-linguistic. Adults rely a lot on language to establish relationships. So if you're not fluent enough, if you're not adult enough in the language, it's extremely hard to make friends in that language. So maybe you will make German friends, but they will speak English with you, and that will not change. So they will keep speaking English with you.
I was just hinting at this idea that it's difficult to make German friends.
Sorry. It's not if you're fluent in German.
That's a different topic, right? But how to make German friends, that would be an interesting other podcast. But often people fail at that, and there the culture comes into play again, because if the cultural differences are so vast, it depends on both parties to kind of be willing to open up for the other one's culture as well, right? And to reflect their own. And that is not always that easy.
There are cultural differences. Also, understanding the concept of friendship. So where certain boundaries are. And this could be an interesting topic for a cultural episode. But I think that if you don't have certain language skills, then you have a bigger problem to deal with before you can even get to the cultural level. I made some German friends at the beginning when I came here, but we were speaking English, of course. I only had one German friend, only one, who was so invested in helping me learn German that he wanted to speak German with me all the time. But our conversations were something like, please give me the pen, or this is called butter. So it was like teaching me German, actually. So this was our interaction. But as soon as we had to discuss anything meaningful, anything daily meaningful, not like philosophy, but like what we're going to do tonight, or what you think about how that guy behaved last night. No, this kind of everyday conversation, we had to switch to English. And this for months and months and months. And there are very few people who are ready to keep up with that, and then to switch language, because this is another problem. If you establish a conversation in a certain language, it's extremely hard to switch. And as a foreigner, speaking with Germans specifically, Germans usually speak English pretty well, especially those who will become friends with a foreigner. Most of them usually speak English pretty well. And before an English speaker, for example, get to a level of German higher than the English level of that German friend, it takes a long time. And so it's very hard they will switch before that point, because English will always be the better language for them to communicate. So it's very risky.
Yeah, you can also express different things differently in two languages, right? I have a nice anecdote from my relationship with my first wife. So the mother of my half Polish, half German son, right? So in the relationship, I think we were mostly speaking Polish because I was at a good enough level and I really liked the practice. But after the divorce, at one point switched to German and she could speak Polish. So everyone was on their safe grounds because, I could argue better in German than I could in Polish. And so could she. So it was more of a fair fight. So that is another thing. I feel always most secure in my mother tongue. And if I don't feel secure in my environment, I always would love to be able to use my mother tongue to sort things out. Until I reach a level like my English now, I possibly, depending on the context, but I possibly could handle most conflicts in English as well. But that took a while. Yeah.
It's interesting. I have a kind of reversed anecdote. Me and my wife, we have been married for 2 years, but we have been living together for 8 years. And our relationship started in German.
Your wife is German, right?
She's German. She's a German native speaker. So we spoke in German from the very first second. But after some years, she started learning some Italian. Mostly to be able to communicate with my parents and also because of general interest in the country. I mean, in Italy, you can eat very well. So holidays are nice in Italy, so why not? And she's actually pretty good in Italian. So she can express herself. She understands a lot when she watches TV shows and so on, or when I speak with my family, when we're all together, she can have kind of a conversation with us and understand. But there is no way we speak Italian together because it doesn't make any sense for us. It feels completely weird because there is such a gap between my German and her Italian, and our relationship is so built in German. We are so used to have a certain pace, certain nuances in our expression and so on, that when we switch to Italian, there is this kind of difference you were talking about. So I am then all of a sudden extremely proficient, I'm native level, and she is struggling to understand. So I should slow down in order to let her understand. And when she expresses herself, she feels like she's actually getting 1/10 through of what she actually means. She feels like a child, and she's not used to feel like that with me. And so we maybe have 5 minutes speaking Italian as a kind of training, but then we switch to German or English. I mean, we can speak English. Sometimes we speak English when we're discussing other topics which are related to English, like programming or a TV show in English. So if we have the same level of proficiency in a language, we can stay there. But yeah, we cannot switch to Italian. Even, in a relationship which is already established and where I would like to help her practice her Italian, but it feels really unnatural.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I have a video online where I basically give advice on how to practice German with your partner. And the essence is don't, because it can risk your relationship, right? So of course you can, but you have to really limit it, like you say, 5 minutes practice here and there, maybe only speak German in the kitchen, but serious matters until it comes naturally, always in a language that you have established, because otherwise the relationship is taking a hit. And kids have the same. I meet many expats, right? And they have kids growing up in Germany, but they don't speak German, or at least not fluent enough. And sometimes when these parents read to the kids in German or try to practice their German with the kids say, no, don't do that. Let that be. I don't like this. Simply because it changes the relationship. It changes, let's say, the level of security around them. Because suddenly something is off, something is different. That's a very interesting thing to observe.
Yes, it feels wrong.
Yeah, for the kids. Yeah, not that it is wrong.
It feels wrong. So if it is wrong is another question. It's harder to answer. But for sure it feels wrong. It's something also we have in our language exchange course on Smart German, right? Tandem training, how to interact with German native in order to practice German. And there is the same thing you said also in your video, right? I said the same thing. So people often hope their close friends and partners, co-workers could help them, but they are the worst people to practice with. So stay away from that as much as you can, till the point where you are actually fluent.
The other thing that also came up before is like the workplace is not a place to learn German or practice German with your co-workers unless you have a level where this is fluent and doesn't inhibit the results of the work. So I taught in companies. I gave lessons there. That's a slightly different topic. But I could observe this firsthand, and you cannot even properly learn the language within the work environment because there's too many other elements of relationship happening there. Because you need to be productive, you need to perform, there's people observing you. If you fail or embarrass yourself, your German takes a hit, or your motivation or your emotional relationship to the German language takes a hit. Because if you're embarrassed, then you don't speak, you don't practice, and you withdraw more and more, while you actually possibly need to do the opposite. So the workplace is not a place to practice your German. It's simply not. Imagine being in a hospital and you practice your German and then someone needs quick help, right? Entschuldigung, das habe ich nicht verstanden. Könnten Sie das nochmal wiederholen?
Mm-hmm.
Oh. Yeah.
Yes. So the problem I think you're expressing here is even more general, is like the best environment to learn, the best conditions to learn are playful ones, where there are very low stakes, where you're allowed to make mistakes, where you can try again. So low stakes, low risks, and so on. And so if you are in Germany and you are using German in order to have actual communication, which is not a game, is real life, stakes are high. And so you have a lot of pressure because the risks are very high. If you misunderstand, if you express something wrong, and your pride is also wounded if you have to ask again and again. So for example, I had to experience this at university. I started my first semester at university in Berlin after I already passed an exam of C2. So theoretically, on paper, I was extremely proficient, like a native. This isn't true at all. The first year was a pain. And in Germany, we have seminars where we read texts before meeting, and then all the students and the teacher meet together, and we have to discuss the papers we read. And those conversations in German, at least for the first year and a half, have been so often so hard psychologically, even humiliating, because, for example, you say something and another student has an objection, or a teacher asks a question about what you said, and you don't understand. And as you said, right, to have to ask in a class of all native speakers, sorry, can you repeat it again? And maybe you don't understand the second time. And so you are stopping the whole seminar, the whole flow. You're preventing other students to keep learning and to keep discussing because only you need to have these questions repeated to you. It feels so bad, so shaming, so humiliating. It's very embarrassing. Or to have an idea, to have something you want to say, and you stuttering, you don't find words, and you feel like a child among adults who is making himself ridiculous. And this is psychologically very taxing, very hard. Of course, it's something you have to get used to a certain degree, but to soften it by being better prepared, it's a good idea. So going back to our main topic, if you can reduce all these problems we're discussing now by being better prepared, I think it's a good investment. It's a good idea, right?
Yeah, also maybe when you are at home, in your own country, in your own place, the conditions might not be ideal, but instead of trying to run away from these conditions into another country, creating a lot more problems, then you already have tried to invest that energy in creating a space in which you can safely learn. Yeah, you could go to a library here. I spent a lot of time in libraries when I was studying, for example. Also in Poland, when I was just learning the language, it's a nice place to be because there's no distraction. So try to invest the time in really preparing well, or preparing the space also, and be creative. Where can I go where I'm not disturbed? Even if that costs a bit of money, it will cost you a fraction of what it would cost you to come here, fuck up your German at the same time, and then go back disappointed.
Yes.
So first take a look at what you have there and how can I improve the situation as where you are, and then invest the time in preparing for coming here.
Also, nowadays, you have a lot more opportunities to practice a language online without having to be there in presence. For example, before I moved to Germany, the first month I was in Italy, I found that the Goethe Institute made a small school in Second Life. I don't know how many people know Second Life nowadays. Is this virtual world, which was very fancy
like the
20 years
metaverse.
ago. It's a kind of a metaverse. It was a strange place. And I've never played around in Second Life, but for this reason. When I found out that Goethe had a school in Second Life. So I created my avatar, I went there, and actually wasn't much. It was like every day for 1 hour, there was a very young teacher, probably a Germanistic student or something, who entertains conversations. And I think it was a good thing. And nowadays there are so many more opportunities to meet with other students of the language or to meet with natives online. There is really no reason to be here. It's way easier to have conversations online. For example, now I'm learning Chinese. If I were in China, I would probably have a better time finding a partner for conversations online, even if I'm sitting in China, instead of going on the street and talking with random people on the street or trying to meet people in bars and so on. So I would still go online instead of going out. And maybe there is one thing I was thinking about that I want to ask if you have experiences with that, because for me it's a very important aspect of this topic. At the very beginning I said it's detrimental, right? One of the reasons why it is so detrimental is that I've seen huge amounts of psychological damage done to people who moved here and weren't able to learn the language in a matter of months or years. A lot of my clients came to me after 2, 3 years, 4 years even, of living in Germany, working in an English environment, of course, trying to learn German and failing at it. And they had an amount of guilt and shame and such a pressure, like they felt like they should have learned German already, and they felt something was so wrong with them from a moral point of view even. And it's crazy also because all these people were extremely accomplished professionals, so people with wonderful careers, very smart minds, very diligent in their work and their learning and so on, who were in such a bad psychological state and were unable completely to practice German anymore because of this psychological state. They thought they were at fault. They thought they were failures somehow. And they felt they should learn German right away because it was already so late. And this prevented them from doing anything because they hated the German language. They hated Germans even because those Germans who keep speaking English with me, they don't want to speak German with me. They think I'm an idiot. I don't know, this kind of thing. And so the way to help them had been to first convince them that they didn't have to learn German. This was the only way I found to help them get out of that situation. First, convince them they were already having a good life in Germany without speaking German, so they could let it go and then reapproach German after some months with a more playful, low stake, a relaxed approach. And then actually they managed to learn German and become proficient. But they were really trapped in the situation. I don't know if you have similar experiences maybe with students.
Absolutely. I even do a little exercise sometimes with people that I already see in a couple of lines in an email. I see where they are stuck. And this is one of the reasons, right? The shame, the guilt. Usually it doesn't really matter. In the end, nobody cares whether you learn German or not. Sure, there are situations where it would be beneficial, or maybe it's holding you back from going a step further in your career or in your relationship to your mother-in-law. Yet in the end, it's something you make up. Guilt is a currency because you pay for something you haven't done. But if you take the guilt away, then take the things as they are. Yeah, I haven't learned German properly. And that's the reality. There's nothing bad or good about it. It has consequences, sure, but the guilt is unnecessary. It doesn't change a thing other than it makes you feel miserable. And it doesn't help you learn German. And one thing that also led to what you just said is 2 days ago, I had a conversation with a woman who lived here 25 years ago, lovely woman, was in the military and then started even 2 businesses here. Yeah, and then had to go home for health reasons. Her German was through and through broken. So every sentence had a mistake or 2 or 3. Not too bad. I could have a fluent conversation with her, easily. And I understood it without going crazy. But of course, if you want to advance in certain fields, you need to fix these things. You can be fluent in bad German, and fixing that's a lot of work. And that takes as long as learning the language almost. This is what I call survival German. I had a sweet anecdote of an older Turkish lady who came into my optician's place. I used to wear glasses. And so I went there to get them adjusted because sometimes they were like crooked. And so that woman came in there, didn't speak a word of German, right? She just put the glasses on the counter and she said one word. She said one word, schief, which means crooked. And of course, that's clear. The message is clear. That's all she needs to learn. And the situation is solved, right? Of course, you cannot have a philosophical discussion about why glasses that are crooked are beautiful. But this is survival German. You can survive in Germany easily with bad German. And that usually happens when you come here too soon or when you rush things. And yes. I always have to tell people, if you want to be fast with learning German, slow down. Do it properly, do it thoroughly. Rather learn proper German first. Speed comes with practice. But if you start speedy German, speed means you are lacking precision.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
So yeah, I agree. Many experience with psychological issues. By the way, I once told a woman that, I suggest you stop learning German. It makes no sense. Why would you do this to yourself? But she didn't like that. I don't know what happened to her. She never got back to me. So that was a bit rough for her, and I possibly would say that a lot gentler these days. But I agree with you. Nobody has to learn German, ever. Yeah? You want to learn German.
There are people who find themselves in a situation where they have no choice. People who have to move and they cannot choose when to move, right? They're already here. Or people who need to pass an exam in order to get the visum confirmed, their green card, or how do you want to call it? And so on and so on. So you have situations where life put pressures on you. But of course, we are discussing a case where you could avoid that kind of pressure, and people put the pressure on themselves because they think it would be beneficial. Actually, there is also a lot of people thinking, oh, I'm not focusing on my German here because I'm not forced to, but if I move there, then I have no choice, so I will learn then. Another bad approach because of what we said, right? Psychologically, you could do yourself a lot of damage. And what you said about telling people they don't have to learn German, this is actually something I do a lot. With all my clients, I try to help them realize how much they actually have to do that, because sometimes they have to do it in a certain amount, right? And how much is just some pressure they're putting on themselves. And to let that pressure go, leave some space for pleasure and desire. Because if you must, if you have to, if you should do something, psychologically it's barely possible to desire that, to have an interest in that, to want to play around with it. Because desire and obligation are opposites. I think actually for those who are listening, we could start giving advice for those who are still not in Germany, still somewhere else. So what they should do, maybe which level they should reach or how they should prepare. And for those who are already here, how can they cope with all these problems we discussed? And this is how we can maybe wrap up this episode. So what are your thoughts about these two situations, Michael?
My suggestion is you finish B2 and come here. Because that's the level on which you can communicate easily, basically like we do, even though it might be C1. But the difference between B2 and C1 is mainly vocabulary. Yeah. So that for sure. And B2 has covered basically everything except specific vocabulary and some more sophisticated ways of saying things or writing things mainly. Because C1 is what you need for university, where you mainly also write and have presentations, which are a different form of communication than what you have in everyday life or at work or with your family. And if you're already here or you think you have to come here without being prepared, create a safe space in which you can study at least half an hour, if not an hour a day, 5 times a week. Just create the stability and frequency. Don't beat yourself up if things don't go as you planned. You might have to skip a learning date simply because life takes over, and then that's it. Life has priority. You can force yourself to do this. Other people try this, or many people try to do this with discipline, by which they usually understand torturing themselves, so forcing themselves to do something. I recommend not to do that. But if that rocks your boat, by all means, discipline yourself.
I think my advice would align with yours mostly. So B2 is a good level, of course. If anybody can reach a B2 level before moving to Germany, nice. It's a good level to come here. So then you can have a lot of fun. because you are at the level where you can actually express yourself enough and understand quite a lot. So it will still be a challenge. Don't think you get here with a B2 and you can communicate with native speakers without any effort. No, it will be, be frustrating, challenging, and so on. But it's a challenge you can take on. If you have to come here before, I would focus mostly on understanding. Michael said it before, right? With this example where he said how frustrating it is to ask, could you repeat it, please? Could you say that again? So not understanding what people say is the worst. Is way worse than not being able to express yourself. Because to express yourself, you can do like the Turkish lady he mentioned. You can just say one word and other people will understand. So if you say just sheaf is okay, so crooked, and they understand, you're referring to the glasses. But if the optician tells you something very complex and you don't understand, and the optician isn't able to break down this complexity to something you can understand, then that's a bad situation to be in. So focus mostly on understanding. So you need as much understanding of the language as you can. If you're already here, I agree with Michael absolutely about letting it go and accepting the situation you're in. And remember what we said today. Most people are struggling as you are. And also those feelings of guilt and shame and so on are normal and natural. So they will come up. You will feel bad about it. You will feel pressured. And part of the challenge is to let them go and accept that you are in this difficult situation where you have to find these moments of peace, where to study German, even if you are an expat, if you are in a new country and are struggling with so many things. And maybe about discipline and so on. What helped me was not discipline itself, was to accept sacrifice. To accept that first 2 years will imply some sacrifice and some suffering, some pain, some feeling alone, because you have to sacrifice things. For example, you have to accept you will spend less time with family and friends because you have to study more in order to get the level of language, in order to make new friends in the new language. Or for example, if you find a group of German friends, to accept the suffering of being the one who doesn't understand everything and the one who cannot make any jokes. I experienced that in my Erasmus the first time when I was in France. I made a group of French friends. I was one of the few Erasmus students among hundreds, thousands, who actually managed to have a group of French friends, because of course conversations in group is harder. But the price I had to pay is to be the one of the group who couldn't actually express themselves properly. It was to be less smart and witty and fun than anybody else, and being the one who is so dumb that doesn't get half of the jokes, and so on. And this is painful. Psychologically, it's painful. Of course, don't torture yourself. So Michael is right, in my opinion. You have to understand what is your threshold, where you can accept it and even enjoy it in the sense of, okay, I'm making some sacrifice today for a better future. But if it starts becoming too taxing, if you can't handle it anymore, well, then you have to reduce that and take care of yourself. And it will be over soon anyway, so don't worry, you will not get stuck there. And we're on the same boat from this point of view, and we'll get through. Michael, you want to say something? I see you in your eyes.
Just many things I could say to that, but if you really struggle, get help. I see many people struggle, and they really struggle, especially with asking for help. My students, if they struggle, I always offer them to help, because if you are happy, I'm happy. Plus, I know my field and I can help you. And same with learning German. If you're in a classroom and you don't get something, ask the teacher. That's what they are paid for. I always say that. I get people in my Q&As that ask me questions, even though they're in a classroom. And I say, why don't you ask your teacher? Yeah, I don't know. They don't speak English, or too many people, no time, whatever reason they give, or they were simply too afraid to ask because for whatever reason it's intimidating. So long message short. Ask for help if you need it. It's fine. We are a community, no matter what some people might think.
Ask other students too, right? At least to share the experience, because you don't have to feel alone. It's not you.
Yes.
It's not your personal problem. You haven't done anything wrong. It's just that most people underestimate how hard it is, and they don't speak enough about these experiences. All students think that's their own problem, and they don't share this suffering or these struggles, these difficulties with others. And when they manage to become fluent, then they kind of either forget about it or don't speak about it. So it's not an experience people share. So from our point of view, Michael and I, this is such a common experience. But for the students themselves, everybody thinks it's just them. So you're not alone, really.
I think on this high note, we wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. And thank you, Alessio, for another enriching and enlivening conversation. See you in the next episode, or hear you in the next episode. And who knows what will be our next topic. I'm sure we will have no lack of words and experiences to share.
Thank you, Michael, too. And to the listeners, if you have any questions, any specific topic, let us know, and we will try to address it in future episodes.
Yes, always curious about your experiences.
Looking forward to our next conversation.
So let's say Auf Wiederhören.
Bye-bye.